The sound of my daughter's hand striking my face echoed across the cemetery like a gunshot. Once, twice, 3 times, each slap harder than the last, each one drawing gasps from the mourners gathered around my husband's grave. "I hope you're next!" Sophie screamed, her voice cracking with rage, her perfectly manicured finger pointing at me like a weapon. The November rain had stopped moments before, leaving the air thick and cold. But nothing was as cold as the hatred burning in my 34-year-old daughter's eyes. I stood there, my cheek burning, my heart shattering into a million pieces, watching as the woman I had raised, loved, and sacrificed everything for, transformed into someone I no longer recognized. My name is Linda Harrison. I'm 62 years old, and I've lived in Vancouver, Canada, for the past 40 years. 2 days ago, my husband of 38 years, Robert Harrison, took his final breath in our bedroom, his hand clasped in mine, his eyes filled with a pain that went far beyond the cancer ravaging his body. The funeral was supposed to be a moment of dignity, a celebration of a man who had built a successful construction business from nothing, who had provided for his family, who had loved deeply despite his flaws. Instead, it became the stage for the most humiliating moment of my entire life. Robert and I had married when I was 24 and he was 27. We were young, hopeful, and desperately in love. Sophie arrived 2 years later, a beautiful baby girl with her father's blue eyes and my dark hair. We gave her everything: private schools, piano lessons, dance classes, summer camps in the mountains, and a university education that cost us $87,000. I worked double shifts as a nurse for 15 years, coming home with aching feet and an exhausted mind, just so she could have the opportunities I never did. Robert built his company brick by brick, often working 16-hour days, missing birthdays and holidays, all to ensure Sophie never wanted for anything. But somewhere along the way, something broke. Sophie grew distant in her 20s, her visits becoming less frequent, her phone calls shorter and colder. She married a real estate developer named Marcus 3 years ago, a man Robert never trusted, a man who always seemed more interested in our family's assets than in genuine connection. I tried to bridge the gap, sending cards, calling every week, showing up at her doorstep with homemade meals. She tolerated me at best, dismissed me at worst. When Robert was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer 6 months ago, I called Sophie immediately, my voice breaking as I shared the devastating news. Her response was cold. "I'll try to visit when I can." She came twice in 6 months. Twice. Each visit lasted less than an hour, and she spent most of the time on her phone, checking messages, scrolling through social media, barely looking at her dying father. Robert never complained, but I saw the hurt in his eyes every time she left. The funeral was held at Mountain View Cemetery, a beautiful plot overlooking the city Robert had helped build. Over 200 people attended: business associates, old friends, neighbors, family members. The service was moving, filled with stories of Robert's generosity and strength. I had held myself together throughout the ceremony, my hands trembling as I placed a white rose on his casket. That's when Sophie approached me, her face twisted with an emotion I couldn't identify, rage mixed with something darker, something that made my blood run cold. And then came the slaps, the accusations, the hatred. The cemetery fell into absolute silence. Everyone froze. Robert's brother Tom, our neighbors the Mitchells, the pastor, the funeral director. 200 pairs of eyes watched as my daughter destroyed me in the most public way imaginable. My face burned, but my hand remained steady as I reached into my black coat pocket and pulled out my phone. "You need to hear something," I said quietly, my voice somehow not breaking despite the earthquake inside my chest. "Everyone needs to hear something. If you're watching this story unfold, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Your support means everything as I share the most painful chapter of my life. My fingers trembled as I navigated to the voice recording app on my phone. The crowd pressed closer, confusion and curiosity replacing shock on their faces. Sophie's expression shifted from rage to uncertainty, her confident stance wavering slightly. "What are you doing?" she demanded, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. Marcus stepped forward, placing a protective hand on her shoulder, his eyes narrowing at me with suspicion. I could see calculation in his expression. He was always calculating, always measuring the angles. "This is a recording your father made 2 days before he died," I announced, my voice carrying across the cemetery despite its trembling quality. He was weak, in terrible pain, but he insisted I help him make it. He said if anything ever happened, if Sophie ever tried to poison everyone against me, I should play it publicly. I never thought I'd need to. I never imagined my own daughter would attack me at her father's funeral. I pressed play. Robert's voice filled the air, thin and strained, but unmistakably his. The effect was immediate and profound. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Sophie's face drained of all color. "My name is Robert Harrison," the recording began, each word clearly enunciated despite the obvious effort it required. "I'm making this recording on November 14th, 2024, with my wife Linda present. I'm of sound mind, though my body is failing. What I'm about to reveal will shock many of you, but the truth must be told." There was a pause filled with labored breathing. Then Robert continued. "For the past 8 months, my daughter Sophie and her husband Marcus have been pressuring me to sign over my company, my properties, and to change my will. They visited me, not out of love, but to convince me that Linda is manipulating me, stealing from me, planning to take everything after I die. They've told me she's been unfaithful, that she's arranged with lawyers to drain my accounts, that she's the reason Sophie stopped visiting years ago." Sophie made a strangled sound, stumbling backward. Marcus's face had gone rigid, his hand dropping from her shoulder. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, some pressing closer to hear better, others stepping back as if from something contagious. I kept the phone raised, letting my husband's truth pour out into the cold November air. "None of it is true," Robert's recorded voice declared, stronger now with conviction. "Linda has been devoted to me for 38 years. She worked herself to exhaustion to help me build our life. When I was starting out and we had nothing, she took double shifts, went without new clothes, cut coupons, and never once complained. She raised our daughter while I was busy building the company. Every success I've had, Linda stood beside me. Every failure she helped me recover from. She's cared for me these past 6 months with a tenderness and dedication that has humbled me daily." The recording continued with devastating precision. "Sophie hasn't visited me out of concern. She's come to my bedside with legal documents, with suggestions that I'm being controlled, with manipulations designed to separate me from my wife. She's brought Marcus, who sits there with his legal pad, taking notes, making suggestions about protecting my assets and ensuring proper legacy planning. They don't ask about my pain, my fears, my memories. They ask about account numbers, property deeds, and who has power of attorney." I watched as Sophie's legs seemed to give out. She sank to her knees on the wet grass, her designer black dress soaking through, her carefully styled hair falling around her face. Marcus made a move to leave, but Tom, Robert's brother, blocked his path, his expression dark with anger. The crowd had completely encircled us now, a jury of mourners bearing witness to a trial none of them expected to attend. 3 weeks ago, Robert's voice continued, Sophie came to me with papers that would have transferred $2.3 million in assets to a trust she and Marcus would control, for my benefit. She told me Linda couldn't be trusted with medical decisions, that I needed to protect myself from her. She cried, manufactured tears, I realized later, and begged me to sign. When I refused, she became cold, told me I was making a terrible mistake, and left without saying goodbye. That was the second to last time I saw my daughter. The weight of Robert's words crushed down on all of us. I could see recognition dawning on faces in the crowd, pieces clicking together, previous interactions recontextualized. Mrs. Chen, our neighbor of 20 years, covered her mouth with her hand, tears streaming down her face. Robert's business partner, James, shook his head slowly, his expression transforming from confusion to disgust as he stared at Sophie and Marcus. The last time I saw Sophie, the recording revealed, was 2 days ago, just hours before I made this recording. Robert's voice on the recording grew heavier with emotion and pain. Sophie came alone that last time. Marcus waited in the car. I could see him from the bedroom window, sitting in that expensive BMW I later learned they'd purchased with a loan using my company as collateral without my knowledge. Sophie sat beside my bed, and for a moment, I hoped she'd finally come as my daughter, not as someone with an agenda. I was foolish. The crowd pressed closer, completely silent except for the occasional sniffle or rustle of fabric. Sophie remained on her knees, her body shaking, but whether from cold, shame, or rage, I couldn't tell. Marcus had stopped trying to leave, perhaps realizing that fleeing would only confirm his guilt. She held my hand. Robert's recorded voice continued, cracking slightly. And she told me she loved me. She said she knew I was dying, that she wanted to make peace before I left. My heart soared for just a moment. My little girl had finally come back to me. Then she said, "Dad, I need you to know that Mom has been planning this for years. She's been waiting for you to die so she can sell everything and run off with some man she met at the hospital." Audible gasps erupted from the crowd. I closed my eyes briefly, remembering that horrible moment, remembering how I'd been in the kitchen making Robert's pain medication smoothie when Sophie arrived, how I'd given them privacy because I thought she'd finally come to say goodbye properly. I asked her where she got this information, Robert's voice said. She told me that Mom's friend Patricia had seen text messages, that there were emails, that everyone knew except me. She begged me to sign a document, right there, in what she knew were possibly my final days, that would prevent Linda from accessing any accounts for 6 months after my death until an investigation could be completed. She had the paper with her. She had a pen. She pressed it into my weak hand and guided it toward the signature line. Sophie let out a sob, but it was drowned out by angry murmurs from the crowd. I saw former colleagues of Robert's shaking their heads, their faces hardened with disgust. The pastor who delivered the eulogy just 20 minutes earlier looked stricken, as if he'd accidentally blessed something unholy. "I didn't sign," Robert stated firmly, his recorded voice gaining strength from conviction. "I told Sophie to leave and never come back unless she was willing to tell me the truth." She stared at me with such hatred. My own daughter looked at me with pure hatred and said, "You're going to die leaving Mom everything, and she'll destroy your legacy. Everything you built will be gone within a year, and it will be your fault for being blind." Then she walked out. I heard her heels clicking down the hallway, heard the front door slam, heard that expensive car start up and drive away. There was a long pause in the recording, filled only with Robert's labored breathing. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with tears. "That was 48 hours ago. I will likely never see my daughter again in this life. The pain of that is worse than any cancer. But I won't die having let her poison everyone against Linda. I won't leave my wife, my devoted, selfless, beautiful wife, to face accusations and attacks without leaving her the truth as armor." The recording continued. "To everyone hearing this, Linda Harrison has been faithful, honest, and devoted. Every dollar in our accounts she earned through her labor or helped me earn through her support. There is no other man. There has never been another man. Patricia never saw any messages because there were no messages to see. My daughter fabricated these stories, manipulated by her husband Marcus, who saw my illness as an opportunity rather than a tragedy." Marcus finally spoke up, his voice defensive. "This is defamation. You can't prove any of—" But he was cut off by Tom, who stepped forward aggressively, his face red with fury. "Shut your mouth," Tom growled. "Let the man finish. He might be dead, but he deserves to be heard." Robert's voice filled the silence again. "I've instructed my lawyer, David Chen, to investigate any unauthorized use of my business as collateral. I've changed my will to leave everything to Linda, with a trust for Sophie that she can only access if she completes therapy and makes genuine amends with her mother. If she refuses, the money will go to charity. Marcus receives nothing, not $1, not one property, not one share of anything I built." The final words of the recording were directed at Sophie. "My daughter, if you're hearing this, know that I loved you until my last breath. But I won't let you destroy the woman who gave up everything to raise you. Your mother deserves better than what you've become. I pray you find your way back to the person we raised you to be. But until then, these are the consequences of your choices. I love you, Sophie. I always will. But I love truth and justice more." The recording ended. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Sophie's sobbing and the distant sound of traffic from the city below. I carefully put my phone back in my pocket, my hands surprisingly steady despite the emotional earthquake I'd just triggered. 200 witnesses had just heard the truth from beyond the grave. The atmosphere in the cemetery transformed from shocked silence to active chaos within seconds. Sophie's sobs grew louder, her body curling into itself on the wet grass as she wrapped her arms around her stomach. Marcus tried once more to leave, but this time several of Robert's former employees blocked his path. Men who had worked for my husband for 20 years, men who had attended our daughter's graduation party, men who now looked at Marcus like he was something they'd scraped off their shoes. "You're not going anywhere," Tom announced, his voice carrying authority despite not being particularly loud. "The police might need to hear about this fraudulent loan you apparently took out using my brother's company." Marcus's face went from pale to ashen. His expensive suit suddenly looked like a costume, his confident demeanor crumbling like wet paper. David Chen, Robert's lawyer and a family friend for 15 years, pushed through the crowd. I'd called him that morning to attend the funeral, knowing this moment might come, but hoping desperately it wouldn't. "Linda," he said gently, taking my elbow, "are you all right?" I nodded, though, truthfully, I felt like I might collapse at any moment. The adrenaline that had sustained me through playing the recording was beginning to fade, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. "I'm fine, David, but I think we need to discuss some things." David nodded grimly, his expression professional, but his eyes kind. He'd been Robert's lawyer since the beginning, handling every contract, every acquisition, every legal detail of building an empire from nothing. He knew exactly what unauthorized loans and forged documents could mean. "Mrs. Harrison," came a voice from the crowd, Detective Sarah Morrison, a woman whose daughter I'd nursed through a difficult appendectomy 3 years ago. She stepped forward in her civilian clothes, having attended as a friend rather than in any official capacity. "I think we need to have a conversation about some of what was revealed in that recording. Fraud, forgery, attempting to manipulate a dying man. These aren't minor issues." Marcus finally found his voice. "This is entrapment. That recording was made under duress. Robert was heavily medicated. He wasn't in his right mind." His desperation was palpable, his words tumbling out too fast, too defensive. Several people in the crowd murmured angrily. They'd all heard Robert's recording clearly state he was of sound mind. "I was there when he made it," I said quietly, but my voice carried in the cold air. "He insisted on making it while he was still lucid, before the morphine doses increased. David was there too, witnessing it remotely via video call. It's completely legal and admissible." David nodded confirmation, pulling out his phone to show the video timestamp and documentation. Sophie finally lifted her head from her hands, her makeup running in dark streaks down her face, her eyes red and swollen. "Mom," she choked out, her voice barely audible. "Mom, please." But she couldn't seem to form any other words. What could she say? What explanation could possibly justify what we'd all just heard? "Please what, Sophie?" I asked, and I was surprised by how calm my voice sounded, despite the storm raging inside me. "Please forgive you for trying to steal from your dying father. Please understand that you were just protecting his assets by accusing me of infidelity and theft. Please look the other way while you and your husband attempted to manipulate a dying man out of everything he'd built." "I didn't know what I was doing," Sophie cried out, her voice cracking. "Marcus told me you were planning to take everything. He showed me documents, bank statements. He convinced me you were the enemy." It was a desperate gambit. Throw Marcus under the bus, claim ignorance, appeal to maternal sympathy. I might have even believed her if I hadn't heard Robert's recording of their final conversation, if I hadn't seen the coldness in her eyes over the past 8 months. "Sophie," I said, and despite everything, my heart broke as I spoke. "You're 34 years old. You have a master's degree in business administration. You're not a child who was tricked. You made choices, cruel, calculated choices, and now you have to face the consequences." Marcus tried a different approach, his voice taking on a placating tone that made my skin crawl. "Mrs. Harrison, we can work this out. There's been a terrible misunderstanding. We were only trying to protect Robert's legacy, to ensure his life's work wasn't—" But Tom cut him off with a bark of harsh laughter. "Protect his legacy? You mean steal it?" "We all heard the recording, Marcus. You took out a loan using my brother's company as collateral without his knowledge or permission. That's fraud. That's theft. That's potentially years in prison." The crowd's mood had shifted from shock to anger, with multiple voices calling out condemnations. Mrs. Chen approached me, taking my cold hands in her warm ones. "Linda, I'm so sorry. We all knew something was wrong these past months, but we didn't realize we should have supported you more." Others nodded, murmuring agreements, and I realized I wasn't alone in this nightmare. The community that had gathered to mourn Robert was now rallying around me. Detective Morrison took charge, her professional demeanor emerging, despite being off duty. Marcus, Sophie, I strongly suggest you both come to the station voluntarily tomorrow morning. We need to discuss the allegations raised in that recording. Bring your lawyers. It wasn't quite an arrest, but it carried the weight of inevitability. Marcus's face had gone completely white, while Sophie seemed to be in shock, staring at nothing. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, people approached me one by one, offering condolences, support, and in several cases, testimony about suspicious interactions they'd had with Sophie and Marcus over the past months. James, Robert's business partner, revealed that Marcus had approached him 3 weeks ago asking about succession planning and whether the company would be vulnerable after Robert's death. The days following the funeral were a blur of police interviews, lawyer consultations, and newspaper headlines. Apparently, playing your deceased husband's recorded testimony at his own funeral was newsworthy enough to make the local Vancouver papers and even catch the attention of a few national outlets. "Funeral turns into fraud revelation," read one headline. "Dying man's recording exposes daughter's betrayal," announced another. I stopped reading them after the third day, unable to stomach seeing my private pain dissected for public consumption. David Chen worked tirelessly, coordinating with Detective Morrison and assembling a complete picture of Marcus and Sophie's schemes. What emerged was far worse than even Robert had known. The unauthorized loan using his company as collateral wasn't a singular incident. It was one of 7 separate fraudulent transactions Marcus had orchestrated over the past 18 months. The total amount involved was staggering: $4.7 million in loans, credit lines, and asset leveraging, all done with forged signatures and doctored documents. How did they think they'd get away with it? I asked David during one of our marathon sessions in his downtown office, surrounded by file boxes and legal documents spread across every surface. Outside the windows, Vancouver's skyline glittered in the early December darkness, indifferent to the human dramas playing out in its towers. David sighed, removing his glasses to rub his tired eyes. They were banking on Robert dying before anyone discovered the discrepancies. Marcus's plan was apparently to claim he'd been given verbal authorization by Robert during his illness, that there was confusion about paperwork, that they were acting in the family's best interests. With Robert gone, and you presumably grief-stricken and uninvolved in business matters, they thought they could control the narrative long enough to extract what they wanted and disappear into their new lifestyle. "But Robert changed his will," I said, still amazed by my husband's foresight even in his final days. David nodded, pulling out a thick document from one of the boxes. "He did more than that. 3 weeks before he died, Robert came to my office. I didn't tell you at the time because he asked me not to worry you. He could barely walk, Linda. I had to help him from the car to my office. But he was determined. He spent 4 hours with me, going through every asset, every account, every property. He set up ironclad trusts, established forensic accounting reviews, and put safeguards in place that would trigger immediate investigations if anyone tried to access or transfer assets inappropriately after his death." Tears stung my eyes as I imagined Robert, dying and in pain, using his remaining strength to protect me from our own daughter. "He knew," I whispered. "He knew she'd try something. He hoped he was wrong," David corrected gently. "But he prepared for the worst. That's who Robert was. Always prepared, always protecting the people he loved." He paused, then continued. "There's something else you need to know. The trust Robert set up for Sophie? It's worth $1.2 million, but with strict conditions. She can access it only after completing at least 2 years of therapy with a licensed psychologist, making genuine amends with you, verified by both you and the therapist, and proving she's dissolved her financial partnership with Marcus." Will she do it?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "That's entirely up to her," David said. "If she refuses or fails to meet the conditions within 5 years, the money goes to the Vancouver Children's Hospital in Robert's name. It's a lifeline, Linda, but only if she's willing to grab it." The police investigation moved forward with surprising speed. Detective Morrison, now officially assigned to the case, discovered that Marcus had a history of financial manipulation stretching back before his marriage to Sophie. He'd been involved in 2 previous schemes involving elderly investors, though nothing had ever been formally charged. He's sophisticated, Morrison explained during one of our meetings at the police station. He targets people through relationships, befriending their children or relatives, gaining trust, then exploiting that access. Your daughter wasn't his first victim, Mrs. Harrison, though that doesn't excuse her participation. Is Sophie facing charges? I asked, the question tasting bitter in my mouth. My daughter, my baby girl, who I'd rocked to sleep 1,000 nights, who I'd taught to read, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged, and whose broken hearts I'd consoled. Now I was asking if she'd be arrested. Morrison's expression was compassionate but professional. That depends on several factors: her level of involvement, what she knew and when, whether she was manipulated or an active participant. The DA is reviewing everything. Marcus will definitely face multiple fraud charges, forgery, theft over $5,000, and potentially more. Sophie's situation is more complicated. A week after the funeral, Sophie's lawyer, a nervous young man named Bradley who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, reached out to David to request a meeting. Sophie wanted to see me, he said, to explain, to apologize, to begin making amends. David asked if I was willing, and I surprised myself by agreeing. I needed to look my daughter in the eye and understand how we'd arrived at this devastating place. The meeting was set for a Tuesday afternoon at David's office, neutral ground where I'd feel safe. I arrived early, my hands shaking as I accepted the tea David's assistant offered. Sophie arrived exactly on time, and the sight of her nearly broke my heart all over again. She looked like she'd aged 10 years in a week, her face pale and drawn, her eyes hollowed by sleeplessness, her expensive clothes hanging slightly loose as if she'd lost weight. She sat across from me at David's conference table, Bradley beside her looking uncomfortable, and for a long moment we just stared at each other. "Mom?" she finally whispered, her voice so small and broken that I had to fight every maternal instinct to reach out and comfort her. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry." Sophie's hands trembled as she clasped them on the polished conference table, her usually immaculate nails bitten down to the quick. Dark circles under her eyes spoke of sleepless nights, and her voice cracked with each word. "I don't know where to start," she admitted, looking at Bradley helplessly, before returning her gaze to me. "How do I explain something I don't fully understand myself?" "Start with the truth," I said quietly, my own hands wrapped around the teacup for warmth and stability. "When did this begin?" Sophie took a shuddering breath. "About 2 years ago, Marcus's real estate investments started failing. He'd been so successful before that, or at least, I thought he had been. I found out later that even his early successes were built on borrowed money and increasingly risky schemes. When the market shifted, everything started collapsing. We owed $680,000 to various creditors, and Marcus was desperate." She paused, wiping tears from her cheeks with trembling fingers. "He started talking about Dad's business, about how successful it was, about how Dad was getting older and would need help managing everything. At first, it seemed like genuine concern. Marcus suggested we get more involved in the family business, that we could help Dad transition toward retirement. I thought it was a good idea, a way to reconnect with you both while also securing our financial future. But it wasn't about connection," I said, "and it wasn't a question." Sophie shook her head miserably. "No. As Marcus learned more about Dad's assets, he became obsessed. He'd spend hours researching property values, company revenues, investment portfolios. He started calculating what everything was worth, talking about inheritance, suggesting that Dad should start transferring assets to avoid estate taxes. When Dad was diagnosed with cancer," Sophie's voice broke completely, and she sobbed openly for several seconds before continuing. "When Dad got sick, Marcus said it was now or never. He said if we didn't act, everything would be tied up in probate, that there would be tax implications, that we needed to protect the family assets. So you started visiting your dying father with legal documents," I said, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. Sophie flinched, but nodded. "Yes, I convinced myself I was helping, that I was protecting Dad's legacy. Marcus kept telling me that you didn't understand business, that you'd make emotional decisions that would destroy everything Dad built. He showed me articles about widows who'd been swindled, statistics about wealth dissipation, examples of estates that collapsed due to poor management." She looked at me with desperate eyes. "Mom, I believed him. I believed that I was protecting Dad from you." The words stung like acid, even though I'd heard them before in Robert's recording. Hearing them directly from Sophie's mouth made them real in a different, more painful way. "What about the infidelity accusations?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "The supposed evidence Patricia saw? The man I was allegedly planning to run away with?" Sophie's face crumpled with shame. "Marcus fabricated all of it. He doctored screenshots of text messages, created fake email accounts, even paid someone to take photos of you at the hospital with a male colleague and present them out of context. He built an entire narrative, and God help me, Mom, I believed it. Or I wanted to believe it because it made everything else easier to justify." Bradley shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware he was witnessing something raw and painful. David remained silent, taking notes, his expression neutral, but his eyes watchful. I felt like I was having an out-of-body experience, watching this devastated woman confess to trying to destroy me, all while recognizing her as the daughter I'd loved since before she was born. "When did you realize the truth?" I asked. "Not until after the funeral," Sophie admitted, her voice hollow. "After you played Dad's recording, Marcus and I went back to our house. I was in shock, trying to process what had happened, what Dad had said. Marcus immediately started talking damage control, what lawyers we'd need, how we could challenge the recording's admissibility, strategies for managing the public perception. That's when I realized he wasn't surprised by what Dad had revealed. He wasn't shocked or apologetic. He was strategic." Sophie's hands clenched into fists. "I started going through his home office that night while he was on the phone with his lawyer. I found files, Mom, folders full of research on Dad's business, printouts of property values, spreadsheets calculating estate values, and," she paused, her voice dropping to a whisper, "templates. Templates for forged documents with Dad's signature already scanned in. Templates for loan applications, for power of attorney forms, for title transfers. Marcus had been planning this for over a year." "Did you know about the fraudulent loans?" David asked, his lawyer instincts taking over. Sophie shook her head vehemently. "No, I swear I didn't know about those until the police contacted me. Marcus handled all our finances. He said he was managing our debt, restructuring our investments, that everything was under control. I was so focused on what Marcus told me about protecting Dad's assets that I never questioned where our money was coming from. I never looked at our bank statements. I just trusted him." "And now?" I asked. "What happens now?" Sophie looked directly at me for the first time with something like hope in her eyes. "I've filed for divorce. I've given the police every document I found in Marcus's office. I've provided testimony about every conversation, every scheme he described to me, every manipulation. My lawyer says I might face reduced charges or immunity if I cooperate fully. But honestly, Mom, I don't care about that. I care about making this right with you." The words hung in the air between us. Part of me wanted to forgive her immediately, to embrace my daughter and comfort her as I'd done when she was a child. But another part, the part that had been slapped and humiliated at her father's funeral, the part that had listened to her accuse me of betrayal while Robert lay dying, wasn't ready to absolve her so easily. "Sophie," I said carefully, "you're 34 years old. Marcus manipulated you, yes, but you made choices. You chose to believe terrible things about me without ever asking me directly. You chose to visit your dying father with legal documents instead of love. You chose to slap me at his funeral, to tell me you hoped I'd die next. Those were your choices, not Marcus's." Sophie nodded, tears streaming down her face. I know, Mom, and I have to live with that forever. I destroyed our relationship. I hurt you and Dad in ways I can never take back. But I want to try. I want to do the therapy Dad required in the trust. I want to understand how I became someone capable of what I did. Her voice broke again. I want my mother back. 3 weeks after that devastating meeting, Marcus was formally arrested. The charges were extensive. 7 counts of fraud, 5 counts of forgery, multiple counts of theft over $5,000, identity theft, and criminal breach of trust. The bail was set at $500,000, which Marcus couldn't make. He'd been living far beyond his means, using the fraudulent loans to maintain an appearance of success while actually drowning in debt. His real estate business, it turned out, was virtually non-existent, a shell company with impressive letterhead but no actual assets. Detective Morrison kept me updated as the investigation expanded. "We've found 3 other families Marcus targeted over the past 7 years," she explained during one of our meetings. Same pattern. He'd befriend elderly people through their children, gain their trust, then manipulate them into signing financial documents. He's been operating this scheme for much longer than we initially thought. Your husband's recording might have saved several other families from similar fates. The media attention intensified as more details emerged. I was contacted by journalists, documentary producers, and even a podcaster who wanted to tell the complete story. I declined all interviews, protecting what little privacy I had left. Sophie faced her own media scrutiny, with articles debating whether she was a victim of Marcus's manipulation or an active participant in the fraud. Public opinion was divided. Some people expressed sympathy for a daughter led astray by a con artist, while others condemned her as equally culpable for betraying her dying father. David Chen worked methodically to untangle the financial mess Marcus had created. Each fraudulent loan had to be investigated, documented, and reported to the respective institutions. The $4.7 million in unauthorized debt attached to Robert's company and properties had to be challenged legally, which required mountains of paperwork, forensic accounting reports, and legal filings. This could take years to fully resolve, David warned me. But we have Robert's documentation, his recordings, and strong evidence that these were unauthorized transactions. The banks will likely be forced to absorb the losses rather than hold the estate responsible. Meanwhile, Robert's business needed attention. James, his longtime partner, stepped up magnificently, managing daily operations while the legal situation resolved. Robert built something solid, James assured me during one of his weekly updates. The company can weather this storm. Actually, now that the truth is out, several clients who'd been approached by Marcus with suspicious proposals have come forward. We're more stable than we thought. The most difficult aspect wasn't the legal battles or financial complexities. It was navigating my relationship with Sophie. True to her word, she'd filed for divorce from Marcus and was cooperating fully with prosecutors. She'd also begun therapy with Dr. Patricia Wells, a psychologist specializing in family trauma and manipulation. Dr. Wells contacted me with Sophie's permission, asking if I'd be willing to participate in family sessions once Sophie had progressed sufficiently in individual therapy. "She's doing the work," Dr. Wells told me over the phone. "She's confronting some very painful truths about herself, about the choices she made, about the way she allowed herself to be manipulated because it was easier than facing financial failure. It's not easy work, and there are days she wants to quit, but she keeps showing up." I agreed to consider family therapy, but not yet. I wasn't ready. The hurt was still too fresh, too raw. Instead, I focused on settling Robert's affairs and beginning to envision what my life would look like moving forward. For 38 years, I'd been part of a unit. Linda and Robert, inseparable, a team. Now I was just Linda, a 62-year-old widow trying to figure out who she was without the man who'd defined half her life. The Vancouver Children's Hospital, the charity designated in Robert's will if Sophie failed to meet the trust conditions, reached out to express their gratitude for Robert's consideration. They'd known him as a donor for years, something I hadn't fully realized. He used to come visit the kids, the hospital director told me, especially around the holidays. He'd dress up as Santa, hand out gifts, spend hours reading to them. He never wanted any recognition for it. Learning these things about Robert after his death was both beautiful and heartbreaking. There were so many facets to the man I'd loved, so many kindnesses he'd performed quietly, without fanfare. It made Sophie's betrayal seem even more tragic. She'd tried to steal from a man who'd spent his life giving to others. 4 months after the funeral, Marcus's trial date was set. The Crown prosecutors had built an overwhelming case, with testimony from multiple victims, forensic accounting evidence, and Sophie's cooperation as a witness. Marcus's lawyer attempted to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutors weren't interested in leniency. "He's a career criminal," the lead prosecutor, Margaret Thornton, explained to me. "This wasn't a one-time mistake or a moment of poor judgment. This was a calculated, years-long operation that destroyed families. We're pursuing the maximum sentence." Sophie wasn't charged, though the prosecutor made clear it was a close decision. Her cooperation was extensive and genuine, Margaret explained. She provided evidence we wouldn't have obtained otherwise, and the psychological evaluation suggests she was significantly manipulated. However, she's not innocent either. She'll carry the consequences of her actions for the rest of her life. During this time, I maintained minimal contact with Sophie, brief text messages, occasional updates through David or Dr. Wells, but nothing substantial. She didn't push for more, respecting my need for space. Every text she sent included some variation of, "I love you, Mom," and "I'm so sorry." I rarely responded, still unable to fully process my feelings. How do you forgive someone for hurting you at your most vulnerable? How do you rebuild trust after such a fundamental betrayal? One unexpected source of comfort came from Tom, Robert's brother, who began visiting me weekly. We'd never been particularly close during Robert's life. Tom lived in Calgary, and our interactions were limited to holidays and special occasions. But after the funeral, something shifted. Tom felt guilty, he admitted, for not realizing what Sophie and Marcus were doing, for not protecting his brother better in those final months. Robert called me about 6 weeks before he died, Tom told me during one visit, his voice rough with emotion. He said if anything happened to him, I needed to look after you. He said Sophie had changed, that he was worried about what would happen after he was gone. I told him he was being paranoid, that Sophie would never hurt you. I was wrong. You couldn't have known, I assured him, though his presence and support meant more than I could express. Maybe not, Tom acknowledged, but I can be here now. You're my sister-in-law, Linda. Your family. And family doesn't abandon family. 6 months after Robert's death, Dr. Wells contacted me again. Sophie's ready, she said simply. She's been working incredibly hard, confronting painful truths and making genuine progress. She'd like to begin family sessions, but only if you're willing. There's no pressure, Linda. This has to be your choice. I spent a week considering it, weighing my anger against my love, my hurt against my hope. Sophie was still my daughter, despite everything. The girl who'd laughed at my terrible jokes, who'd called me crying after her first heartbreak, who'd graduated top of her class and made us so proud, that person was still in there somewhere, beneath the pain and mistakes. Finally, I agreed to one session, just one, to see if healing was even possible. The therapy office was in a quiet building near Stanley Park, with large windows overlooking the water. Dr. Wells was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a gentle but firm demeanor. She welcomed me warmly, explaining the process and setting ground rules. "This is a safe space for both of you," she said. "No accusations, no attacks, just honest communication about feelings and experiences." Sophie arrived looking nervous, her hands shaking as she took the seat across from me. She'd lost more weight, I noticed, and there was a fragility about her that I'd never seen before, as if she might shatter at any moment. We sat in uncomfortable silence for a minute before Dr. Wells prompted Sophie to begin. "Mom," Sophie started, her voice barely above a whisper, "I've spent 6 months trying to understand how I became someone who could hurt you the way I did. Dr. Wells has helped me see patterns in my life that I'd never recognized. My need for approval, my fear of failure, my tendency to avoid difficult truths by believing comfortable lies." She paused, gathering courage. "I want to tell you about my life with Marcus, about how I got to the point where I could believe such horrible things about you." Over the next hour, Sophie painted a picture of a marriage that had been troubled from the start. Marcus had been charming, successful, and confident, everything she'd thought she wanted, but beneath the surface, he was controlling and manipulative. He'd gradually isolated her from friends, convinced her that her job wasn't important enough to keep, made her financially dependent on him. When his businesses started failing, he became increasingly desperate and volatile. "I was ashamed," Sophie admitted, tears rolling down her cheeks. "I was ashamed that my marriage was failing, ashamed that we were drowning in debt, ashamed to come to you and Dad and admit I'd made such a terrible choice. It was easier to believe Marcus when he said you were the problem, that Dad was holding back what we deserved, that everyone else was wrong except us." She described how Marcus had systematically convinced her that I was untrustworthy, showing her those doctored messages, making comments about seeing me with other men, suggesting that I'd always resented her success and wanted to keep everything for myself. "He created an entire alternate reality," Sophie said, "and I chose to live in it because confronting the truth meant admitting my own failures." "When did you stop loving me?" I asked, the question I'd been carrying for months, finally emerging. Sophie's eyes widened in shock. "I never stopped loving you, Mom. Never. But I buried that love under layers of lies and justifications until I couldn't feel it anymore. I convinced myself that protecting myself from financial ruin was more important than protecting our relationship. I chose money over you, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. Dr. Wells guided us through exercises designed to rebuild communication and understanding. She asked Sophie to identify specific moments when she'd made active choices to hurt me, not just passive moments of being manipulated. This was harder for Sophie, requiring her to take full ownership rather than hiding behind Marcus's influence. At Dad's funeral, Sophie said, her voice breaking, when I slapped you, Marcus didn't tell me to do that. He was standing 20 feet away. That was all me. I was so angry. At Dad for choosing you over me in his will. At you for being the good person while I'd become the villain. At myself for destroying everything. I wanted to hurt you the way I was hurting, and that's unforgivable. But you want me to forgive you, I said, not quite a question. Sophie shook her head. I want to earn your forgiveness, if that's even possible. I know I don't deserve it right now. I might never deserve it. But I want to try to become someone who could deserve it someday. That first session was emotionally exhausting. I left feeling drained, but oddly hopeful. Sophie was doing the work, confronting her demons, taking responsibility. It wasn't enough to erase what had happened, but it was a beginning. Dr. Wells suggested we continue weekly sessions, and I agreed to try. Over the following months, the therapy sessions became a regular part of my life. Some weeks were harder than others. There were sessions where I couldn't stop crying, where my anger bubbled over, and I told Sophie exactly how much she'd hurt me. There were sessions where Sophie broke down, overwhelmed by guilt and shame. But slowly, incrementally, we began to rebuild something resembling a relationship. Dr. Wells taught us communication techniques, helped us establish boundaries, and guided us through forgiveness exercises. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting or excusing, she explained. It's about releasing the poison of anger so it stops destroying you from the inside. You can forgive someone and still acknowledge they caused great harm. One breakthrough came during a session about 7 months in. Sophie had been describing her childhood, trying to understand when she'd started valuing material success over relationships. I think it started in high school, she said thoughtfully. I remember you and Dad arguing about money sometimes. Nothing terrible, just the normal stress of managing expenses. But I decided then that I never wanted to struggle financially, that I'd do whatever it took to be secure. We argued about my nursing schedule, I remembered. I wanted to cut back on hours to spend more time with you, and Robert worried about the lost income. Sophie nodded. I heard those arguments and decided money was the most important thing. If you and Dad were stressed about it, if it caused tension in your marriage, then clearly having enough money would solve everything. I became obsessed with financial security, with status symbols, with proving I was successful. When I met Marcus, and he seemed so financially successful, I thought I'd found the answer. I never looked deeper. Money was never the point, I said gently. Your father and I argued sometimes, yes, but we were a team. We figured it out together. The point was always love, Sophie. The point was always family. I know that now, Sophie whispered. I'm 34 years old, and I'm finally understanding what you and Dad tried to teach me when I was a child. Marcus's trial began in early June, nearly 7 months after Robert's death. The courthouse was packed with journalists, victims of Marcus's other schemes, and curious onlookers who'd followed the case in the media. I attended every day, sitting in the gallery with Tom beside me for support. Sophie was there too, but we sat separately. She'd be testifying for the prosecution, and it was important to maintain some distance. The Crown's case was methodical and devastating. They presented forensic accounting evidence showing how Marcus had systematically stolen from multiple families over 7 years. The total amount exceeded $8.2 million, far more than even the police had initially discovered. Document specialists testified about the forged signatures. Handwriting experts confirmed that Marcus had practiced mimicking his victims' signatures, and IT experts showed how he'd created fake email accounts and doctored digital communications. The most powerful testimony came from Marcus's previous victims. An elderly man named Harold Patterson described how Marcus had befriended his son, gained access to Harold's accounts, and stolen $1.3 million over 2 years. Harold's voice shook as he explained how the theft had destroyed his retirement, forcing him to sell his home and move in with his daughter. I trusted him, Harold said, looking directly at Marcus. He came to family dinners, called me dad, and robbed me blind. Another victim, a widow named Margaret Singh, testified about how Marcus had approached her after her husband's death, offering to help manage her finances. Within 18 months, he'd transferred $780,000 out of her accounts into shell companies he controlled. He was at my husband's funeral, Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. He hugged me, told me he'd take care of everything, and then he stole my husband's life insurance, the money that was supposed to support me for the rest of my life. Sitting in that courtroom, listening to these testimonies, I realized how close Sophie and I had come to complete financial ruin. If Robert hadn't been suspicious, if he hadn't documented everything, if he hadn't made that recording, Marcus would have succeeded. Sophie and I would have spent years fighting over a depleted estate, while Marcus disappeared with millions. When Sophie took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. This was the testimony everyone had been waiting for. The daughter who'd participated in her father's betrayal, now turning against her husband. Sophie wore a simple navy dress, her hair pulled back, her face pale but composed. She'd been preparing for this moment for months, working with Dr. Wells to find the strength to face her complicity publicly. The prosecutor, Margaret Thornton, led Sophie through her testimony carefully. Sophie described meeting Marcus, their courtship, the gradual erosion of her judgment and independence. She explained how Marcus had manipulated her perception of her parents, showing her fabricated evidence of my supposed infidelity and financial mismanagement. She detailed the conversations where Marcus had pressured her to approach Robert with legal documents, the strategies he'd outlined for gaining control of the estate. "Did you know about the fraudulent loans?" Margaret asked. "No," Sophie answered firmly. "I didn't know until after my father's funeral, when I found the documents in Marcus's home office. He'd kept that part of his scheme completely hidden from me. But you did participate in attempting to manipulate your dying father into signing documents that would have given Marcus control over his assets," Margaret stated. It wasn't a question. Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "Yes, I did. I convinced myself I was protecting my father's legacy, but I was really trying to salvage my own failing marriage and financial situation. I made terrible choices, and I hurt both my parents terribly. That's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life." Marcus's defense attorney, a sharp-featured man named Robert Carlyle, tried to paint Sophie as the true mastermind, suggesting she'd manipulated Marcus and was now throwing him under the bus to avoid prosecution. But Sophie remained composed under cross-examination, calmly answering each question and taking responsibility for her actions, while also clearly delineating what she'd known versus what Marcus had hidden from her. The most dramatic moment came when the prosecutor played Robert's recording for the court. The effect was electric. Jurors leaned forward. Several people in the gallery began crying, and Marcus visibly flinched as his father-in-law's voice filled the courtroom. Hearing Robert's words again, in this formal setting, gave them even more weight and power. He was still protecting me, still fighting for truth, even from beyond the grave. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The evidence was overwhelming, and Marcus's defense was weak, mostly attempts to minimize his culpability or suggest that his victims had been willing participants. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. The sentencing hearing was held 2 weeks later. Multiple victims gave impact statements, describing the financial and emotional devastation Marcus had caused. When it was my turn, I stood at the podium, looking directly at Marcus for the first time since the funeral. "You didn't just steal money," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "You stole my husband's final months. Instead of spending that precious time making memories and saying goodbye, we spent it defending ourselves against your lies and manipulations. You turned my daughter against me, convinced her to believe horrible things about her own mother. You attempted to steal my husband's legacy, the company he'd spent 40 years building. You destroyed my family." I paused, then continued. "But you failed. My husband was smarter than you, stronger than you, and more loving than you could ever comprehend. He protected me even as he was dying, and his love is what will sustain me long after you're forgotten in whatever prison cell they put you in." The judge, a stern woman named Justice Helena Morrison, sentenced Marcus to 14 years in federal prison. "You are a predator," she told him, "who targeted vulnerable families during their most difficult moments. You showed no remorse, no empathy, no conscience. This sentence reflects the severity of your crimes and the lasting damage you've caused. Marcus was led away in handcuffs, his face expressionless. I felt no satisfaction watching him go, only exhaustion and a profound sadness for all the destruction he'd caused. As we left the courthouse, reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but I kept my head down and let David guide me through the crowd to the waiting car. It's been 18 months since Robert's death, 12 months since Marcus's conviction, and I'm finally beginning to understand what healing looks like. It's not a straight line or a sudden transformation. It's small moments of peace, gradual acceptance, and the slow rebuilding of trust and love that had been shattered. Sophie and I have been in therapy together for over a year now. She's also continued her individual sessions, working through the deeper psychological issues that made her vulnerable to Marcus's manipulation. The trust fund Robert established for her remains untouched. She has 2 more years to complete the conditions before it becomes inaccessible. Dr. Wells believes she'll meet them all, and honestly, so do I. Our relationship is different now. More honest, more boundaried, but also more real. Sophie has moved into a modest apartment downtown, taken a job in marketing at a nonprofit, and is living within her means for the first time in her adult life. We have dinner together once a week, sometimes at my house, sometimes at her apartment. The conversations aren't always easy, but they're genuine. I'm learning who I am without wealth, without status, without the things I thought defined me, Sophie told me recently over homemade lasagna at my kitchen table. The same table where she'd done her homework as a child. It's terrifying and liberating at the same time. The legal battles over Marcus's fraudulent loans have largely been resolved. David's thorough documentation and Robert's foresight meant that most of the banks absorbed the losses rather than pursuing the estate. Robert's company is thriving under James's management, and I've taken a more active role in understanding the business Robert built. It's a way of staying connected to him, of honoring his legacy. I've also started a foundation in Robert's name, the Robert Harrison Family Protection Foundation, dedicated to helping families recognize and protect themselves from financial exploitation. We provide free legal consultations, educational workshops, and support groups for people who've been victimized by similar schemes. Harold Patterson and Margaret Singh have both become involved, turning their painful experiences into advocacy work that helps others. The Vancouver Children's Hospital received a significant donation from Robert's estate, not the full trust fund, since Sophie is working to meet the conditions, but a separate bequest Robert had arranged. They've named a new wing after him, the Robert Harrison Pediatric Care Center. I attended the dedication ceremony last month, and seeing the plaque with his name, knowing that sick children will be helped because of his generosity, brought me more peace than I'd felt in months. Tom has become a regular presence in my life, visiting Vancouver frequently and always checking in. "You're stuck with me now," he joked last week. "Robert made me promise to look after you, and I'm not breaking a deathbed promise to my brother." The relationship I have with Tom has become one of the unexpected gifts of this painful journey. Family I didn't know I needed, showing up exactly when I needed them most. Sophie and I talk about Robert often now, sharing memories, laughing at his terrible dad jokes, crying over the milestones he'll miss. She's working on writing him a letter, something Dr. Wells suggested, expressing everything she never got to say, all the apologies and gratitude and love that went unspoken when he was alive. She asked if she could read it to me when it's finished, and I agreed. It won't change the past, but it might help both of us find closure. Last week, on what would have been Robert's 66th birthday, Sophie and I went to the cemetery together. We brought white roses, his favorite, and stood beside his grave in comfortable silence. "I'm becoming the daughter he deserved," Sophie said quietly. "It's too late for him to see it, but I'm trying." "He knew you would," I told her, surprising both of us with my certainty. "In his recording, he said he hoped you'd find your way back. He believed in you, Sophie, even when you didn't believe in yourself." We stood there as the sun set over Vancouver, 2 women bound by blood and pain and the slow, difficult work of healing. The journey isn't over. Maybe it never will be completely. But we're walking it together, one step at a time, carrying Robert's love with us as both a comfort and a challenge to be better than our worst moments. If you've watched this entire story, thank you for being part of my healing journey. Sometimes the most broken things can be mended, though they'll never be quite the same as before. But perhaps that's okay. Perhaps the cracks are where the light gets in, where new growth becomes possible, where we learn what really matters. As I stand here today, 64 years old and starting a new chapter of life I never expected to write, I carry with me the lessons of this devastating year, that love is more valuable than any amount of money, that truth has power even beyond death, that forgiveness is possible even when it seems impossible, and that family, real family, shows up, stays present, and does the hard work of rebuilding what was broken. Robert's final gift to me wasn't the financial security he'd worked so hard to provide, though I'm grateful for it. His final gift was the truth, documented, recorded, undeniable, that gave me the strength to stand firm against lies and manipulation. He protected me even when he couldn't be there to hold my hand, and that love sustains me still. To everyone watching, wherever you are in the world, if you enjoyed this story and found meaning in my journey, please subscribe to this channel and leave a like on this video. Most importantly, I'd love to know I'm not alone in this digital space. Please leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Your presence, even virtual, reminds me that we're all connected by our stories, our struggles, and our hope for better tomorrows. The cemetery is quiet now, as Sophie and I turn to leave, our footsteps crunching on the gravel path. Behind us, Robert's grave stands as a testament to a life well lived, to battles fought with integrity, to love that transcends even death. Ahead of us, the future stretches uncertain, but no longer terrifying. We're walking toward it together, mother and daughter, wounded but healing, carrying the past, but no longer imprisoned by it. And somewhere, I like to believe, Robert is watching over us both, finally at peace.